Greetings. In this video, I want to share some brief thoughts on Eʋegbe, Yiddish, and Lashawan Quadash. More specifically, I want to ever so briefly and sort of informally share my thoughts on the proximities, the respective proximities of these different languages to Biblical Hebrew. And this video is inspired by some things that a few different gentlemen had said, from Amir al-Umara, the Orthodox Moor, Rudi Heinrich, things that I saw them say on social media recently, or what inspired this video. So I'm going to show what these different gentlemen said and then share my thoughts. So first up is Amir al-Umara, or as he calls himself, Amir. He doesn't call himself Amir al-Umara. I came up with that. Before I get into his tweet, let me just give a little bit of background on that. I've actually long been amused by the fact that Qadafi, about a decade ago, called himself Malik al-Malouk, the King of Kings, or Malik al-Malouk إفريقيا, the king of the kings of Africa, or something like that. But even more amusing, he got different political bodies to declare him by that title. The African Union declared him such at a session there. I remember at the United Nations General Assembly, I think in 2010, the president of the General Assembly called him Malik al-Malouk and introduced him as Malik al-Malouk. And even Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, the president of one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, at a meeting of the Arab League, introduced Qadafi as ملك الملوك.
الأخ قائد الثورة الفاتح من سبتمبر العظيم، رئيس الاتحاد الإفريقي وملك ملوك إفريقيا التقليديين رئيس معمر القذافي.
So call me silly, but I had the thought that if Qadafi can call himself Malik al-Muluk, the King of Kings, then I'm going to go ahead and call my brother Amir al-Umara, the Amir of Amirs. So that's the background behind, me calling him Amir al-Umara. It's just a little joke that I have. But anyway, let's get back to this tweet. So forgive that little segue there. But, getting to this tweet, which I wanted to start with, Amir al-Umara was noting that the TEOTW twins, who recently endorsed Eʋegbe as quote-unquote true Hebrew, trash and reject Lashawan Quadash. And for example, you can see that in this YouTube community post here, where they're basically lumping Lashawan Quadash, which they call Camp Hebrew, in with Yiddish, as a way of expressing their disdain for it. And so Amir al-Umara, while discussing their stance on Hebrew, which takes a position in which certain languages in Africa, which are not recognized as Semitic languages, are supposedly, the closest thing to Hebrew. And in the midst of that, he was noting that they themselves reject Lashawan Quadash. And so seeing Amir's tweet inspired me to contemplate, a comparison of not just Eʋegbe and modern Israeli Hebrew, but rather Lashawan Quadash and Eʋegbe. And the conclusion that I reached, I expressed in this tweet here, which was in reply to my brother Amir. And that is that, the only thing that Eʋegbe, as far as Eʋegbe's proximity to Hebrew, the only thing that Eʋegbe has over Lashawan Quadash is the fact that it correctly recognizes a much richer system, or a richer spectrum of vocalizations. That's the one place where it's correct, and I think Lashawan Quadash is mistaken. But aside from that, when you get into vocabulary and grammar, Lashawan Quadash is far closer to Biblical Hebrew than Eʋegbe is. Now, I know that some are going to balk at that and say, well, what are you talking about? Eʋegbe is a real language, while Lashawan Quadash is not. It's not a real language. Now, I just want to say a couple of things. First off, I don't take the position that Lashawan Quadash is not a language. I'm fully on board with saying it's not a living language, or it's not a natural language, with saying it's an artificial language, a theoretical language. But nonetheless, I would say that it is a language, and not only that, it qualifies as a form of Hebrew. And this isn't a new position for me. You can find videos going back nearly 3 years, in which, for example, Al-Azhar Ben Loya, the leader of Sicarii, is noting that that's my position.
Abu's a linguist, but what did Abu tell you? Abu told you that Lashawan Quadash is Hebrew. Don't worry, big up to Abu. Abu is a true scholar and gentleman. I want to say that now on this video.
Now, I want to be careful to note that I don't intend this as some sort of a jab against Ewegbe, which, again, I consider to be a complex and interesting and beautiful language. And, of course, I recognize Ewegbe as a living language with millions of speakers. But, you know, saying that Lashawan Quadash is closer, even though it's not a living language, is closer to biblical Hebrew than Ewegbe, which is a living language, you know, that's not a knock against Eʋegbe. For example, let's say Esperanto is also not a living language. If I said that Esperanto is the artificial language, Esperanto is closer to various Romance languages than Japanese is, and Japanese is a living language, that's not a knock against Japanese. It's just a fact about their respective vocabularies, for example. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So, you know, I think just as if you tried to compare Eʋegbe, if you did a meaningful comparison of Eʋegbe to modern Israeli Hebrew, you're going to find that modern Israeli Hebrew has far more in common with biblical Hebrew than Eʋegbe does in terms of grammar, in terms of vocabulary, etc. So too, if you compared Eʋegbe to Lashawan Quadash, you're going to get the same result. Lashawan Quadash is far closer to biblical Hebrew, and this should not be a surprise. I've long likened, for years, I've likened Lashawan Quadash to modern Israeli Hebrew. I've described it as being very similar to modern Israeli Hebrew, just modern, but, you know, except with its system of pronunciation stripped away or drastically simplified. So in this case, you know, being that the major difference between modern Israeli Hebrew and Lashawan Quadash, of course, aside from various bits of vocabulary, the other major difference is, you know, the system of vocalization. Once you get past that, their grammars are essentially the same. And, you know, at least in theory, not necessarily always in practice. But whatever the case, you know, once you concede that, then it should make sense that what I say about modern Israeli Hebrew relative to Eʋegbe is also going to apply to Lashawan Quadash relative to Eʋegbe. Even Lashawan Quadash is closer, far closer to biblical Hebrew than Eʋegbe is. So that was the thought, which was inspired by my brother, by a tweet posted by my brother Amir al-Umara. But moving on from that, I now want to go to another thought, a related thought, which was inspired by some things which were said by the Orthodox Moor and Rudi Heinrich independently of each other. And I'm going to show what they said in a moment. But to give a little bit of background, last night I was watching and also participating very, very briefly and sporadically, participating in the discussion on the Genesis 49ers channel about Ron Dalton. And there was a portion where Yeshub showed some pages from one of Ron Dalton's recent books in which he was discussing Aramaic loan words that appeared in a certain Indian language. And so, you know, in that discussion, I started likening his exploration of Malayalam to a similar exploration of Yiddish as a thought experiment. And the Orthodox Moor asked a very interesting question, which segued into a comparison of Yiddish and Eʋegbe. And this was also a thought. It captured a thought which was, or echoed a thought indirectly, which was offered by Rudi Heinrich. So I'm going to play a clip from a relevant portion of that show on the Genesis 49ers channel. And then you'll see Orthodox Moor's question, and I'll also put on the screen a comment that was made by Rudi Heinrich. And of course, I'll link to all my sources. So here, listen to this, which, while we start out discussing, you know, Malayalam and Yiddish, we wind up segueing into a discussion on comparing Eʋegbe and Yiddish. And then I'll share my thoughts. That page is incredible. As someone who has an amateur interest in languages,
Abu was sitting here reading this quietly.
I was.
I knew it, bro.
Here's my thought: if you can make Malayalam a Semitic language, by that logic, you could make Yiddish a Semitic language. And here's what I mean by that: Yiddish speakers, because they practice Judaism and have a Hebrew and Aramaic liturgy, will have a little bit of Hebrew and Aramaic in their language, the loan words that they borrow from their liturgy. It's the same thing with these Syriac Christians in India. They have a Syriac liturgy because they're essentially Syrian Orthodox Christians. So that's where they get these Aramaic terms. They're loan words from Syriac because of their liturgy. So the argument to make Malayalam Semitic could be used just as easily to make Yiddish Semitic or English, Semitic.
I can't resist. So based upon that, is there more Hebrew loan words in Yiddish or in the Ewe language?
Rudi Heinrich brought that up. Honestly, I mean, I hadn't thought about it before Rudi brought that up, but honestly, I think there's going to be more Hebrew loan words in Yiddish than there is in Ewegbe or Eʋegbe, as they say. I have, but of course, I'm willing to discuss it with proponents of the view that Eʋegbe is.
I mean, I lightweight. I would agree with you on that.
So here's how I would sum it up: the standards which are set in order to allow for Eʋegbe to be classified as Hebrew, Yiddish could easily meet those standards. And what I mean is, proponents of this idea of Eʋegbe as Hebrew, what they engage in is this practice of taking Eʋegbe terms that sound similar to Hebrew terms, and then they leap from that to the conclusion that this means that Eʋegbe is therefore Hebrew. Well, if that's the game we're going to play, let's be honest, Yiddish also has a bunch of terms that are similar to Hebrew terms because Yiddish has actual loan words from Hebrew, a bunch of loan words from Hebrew. So if the whole argument is, hey, look, this language has a handful of terms that seem like Hebrew, therefore the language itself is Hebrew, well, Yiddish is going to easily meet that standard. If you set the bar so low that Eʋegbe can qualify as Hebrew, by that low standard, Yiddish is going to qualify as Hebrew as well. And so, to echo the Orthodox Moor's question and the point or the claim made by Rudi, I do think that Yiddish has more Hebrew loan words than Eʋegbe, because I imagine Eʋegbe doesn't have a lot of loan words, a lot of Hebrew loan words, but maybe it has some because, biblical terms and so on. But, for people who want to discuss this, I know this is a little bit different, than comparing Lashawan Quadash or modern Israeli Hebrew, obviously, because Yiddish, and I mean actual Yiddish, not modern Israeli Hebrew. Yiddish is not a Semitic language. It's a Germanic language, and therefore it is fun to compare Yiddish to Eʋegbe and talk about their relative proximities to biblical Hebrew and, what our standards are. So if any proponent of the idea of Eʋegbe as Hebrew would like to discuss that, I'd certainly be interested. So in closing, let me sum up this video with 3 points. First, modern Israeli Hebrew is closer to biblical Hebrew than Eʋegbe is. Second, Lashawan Quadash is closer to biblical Hebrew than Eʋegbe is. And finally, third, even Yiddish, as far as it is from Hebrew, even though Yiddish is outside of the family of Semitic languages, even Yiddish might have more in common with biblical Hebrew than Eʋegbe does, at least in terms of vocabulary. Neither of them are very similar in terms of grammar. So those are the 3 points which basically sum up my thoughts in this video, after which these thoughts were inspired, as I said, by, certain comments made on social media by Amir al-Umara and the Orthodox Moor and Rudi Heinrich. Oh, and by the way, when I talk about Amir, just to be clear, I'm not talking about Ngozi. This is a different Amir. This is the Amir that has appeared on Vocab Malone's channel. But whatever the case, if anyone would like to discuss this, I look forward to the comments of others. Always welcome comments, especially from proponents of the idea of Eʋegbe as Hebrew. On that note, I'll close here. God bless.